For decades, governments have quietly explored whether human consciousness can bend reality. Most people have never even heard of it.
From the CIA's secret project Stargate to Princeton's controversial studies on random number generators, the evidence has been hiding in plain sight.
And here's the twist. Much of what those experiments hinted at sounds eerily similar to what one man, Darius Wright, has been saying since the 1980s.
For 30 years, scientists dismissed him as a dreamer, or worse, a fraud. But what happens if the world finally puts his boldest claims to the test?
Stay with us, because by the end of this episode, you'll see how real research lines up with Wright's most impossible ideas, and why some scientists are terrified of what that could mean. Darius Wright's message has always been simple, yet outrageous. He claims that consciousness isn't locked inside the brain. It can step outside, travel, and even connect to what he calls your quantum double.
According to Wright, this double lives in parallel realities, holding knowledge and experiences you could never access in ordinary life. He insists that with the right protocols, anyone can make contact.
But that's not all. Wright argues that focused awareness can influence matter itself, not just at the tiny scale of quantum physics, but in the everyday world around us.
To mainstream science, these ideas sounded like pure pseudoscience. From 1987 onward, Wright was ridiculed, banned from conferences, and treated as if he were dangerous to academic credibility.
And yet, something didn't add up. Because while Wright was being silenced, government agencies and elite universities were quietly running experiments on ideas that sounded very familiar.
The question is, if his claims are nonsense, why were institutions spending millions secretly testing the very same possibilities?
What happened in 2021 forced the scientific world to face this contradiction, and it changed everything. In late 2021, something unexpected happened. A set of declassified files surfaced, documents from old government programs that most people thought were science fiction.
Among them were reports from Project Stargate, the CIA's attempt at training psychic spies. Yes, you heard that right. While professors were mocking the idea in classrooms, government officers were literally asking people to close their eyes and find a submarine.
And here's where things got awkward. The language in those files, phrases like observer effect, non-local awareness, even parallel self-access, sounded disturbingly similar to what Wright had been talking about for decades.
Of course, no one was about to say, hey, maybe this guy we've been ignoring since the 80s was onto something. Instead, the scientific community pulled their favorite trick. Act like nothing happened and hope people don't notice.
But people did notice. Young researchers, graduate students, people with fresh eyes, they started asking questions their professors didn't want to answer.
One student at Princeton even asked, if consciousness research is just fantasy, then why did our own university spend 30 years secretly funding it? Which, let's be honest, is a really bad question to get from your student if you're the one grading their thesis.
Meanwhile, Wright's following outside academia kept growing. To many, he looked less like a fringe thinker and more like someone who had been saying out loud what the institutions were whispering in secret.
And eventually, the pressure built to a point where scientists had no choice. They realized if we don't test these claims, we'll look like the ones avoiding the evidence.
So, the stage was set. The question wasn't, should we test Wright anymore? It was, what happens when we do? Now, let's ground this in reality. Darius Wright himself has never been formally tested in a university lab. That part remains speculation.
But others have been tested, and what happened in those experiments is just as fascinating. Precedent number 1, Project Stargate, remote viewing.
In the 1970s and 80s, the CIA funded Project Stargate. People like Ingo Swann and Pat Price were tested under controlled conditions.
Swann, for example, described details of Jupiter's atmosphere, rings, magnetic features that NASA only confirmed years later with the Voyager mission. Coincidence? Maybe, but it left more than a few scientists scratching their heads.
Precedent number 2, Uri Geller, Stanford Research Institute. Another case, Uri Geller. Controversial, yes, but tested at the Stanford Research Institute. Under lab conditions, he seemed to reproduce drawings sealed in envelopes and even influenced instruments at a distance.
The results were so unusual that the CIA classified them for years. Imagine that, calling someone a fraud in public while filing his test results under secret in private.
Precedent number 3, Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research, PEAR Lab, at Princeton University, which ran for almost 30 years. Hundreds of volunteers tried to influence random number generators with nothing but intention.
The deviations were tiny, but statistically significant. In other words, the data suggested that consciousness could in fact nudge physical systems. The speculative leap. What about Wright?
So here's the question. If ordinary volunteers and controversial figures showed measurable effects, what would happen if someone like Darius Wright, who is trained in these states for decades, was tested under today's advanced technology?
Would his observer protocol light up EEG scans in ways we've never seen? Could his information retrieval beat statistical odds? Might quantum random number generators bend under his focus?
We don't know, because it hasn't been done. But history shows us this. Whenever consciousness has been tested, strange results follow.
Which means the real shock isn't imagining Wright succeeding. The real shock is realizing science has already seen hints of this before and chose to look away.
Let's imagine what the scientists would see if those tests actually happened. Not vague impressions, but data, instruments, numbers that refuse to behave.
Test number 1, the observer protocol. Wright sits in the isolation chamber, silent, eyes closed. At first, the readouts look normal. Then suddenly, gamma wave activity spikes, patterns the EEG tech has never seen before.
Even stranger, the lab's environmental sensors start registering tiny fluctuations, as if the air itself was vibrating. One researcher whispers, either we're watching consciousness expand, or the building is about to explode.
Test number 2, information retrieval. The statisticians were ready to laugh, but Wright correctly describes 4 out of 5 sealed envelopes, details he couldn't possibly know.
When the accuracy rate comes back at 80%, way beyond chance, the team runs the calculations 3 times. Each time, the result is the same. One scientist mutters, "I think my career just quit on me."
And then the third test, the consciousness field effects. Remember, random number generators are supposed to be untouchable, pure quantum chaos. But during Wright's focus sessions, the data starts bending into patterns. Patterns strong enough that the statistician stops and says, if this were poker, he just pulled 5 aces in a row.
Instruments glitch, computers freeze, even the lab's atomic clock drifts a fraction of a second, something it shouldn't do. One note in the log simply reads, "Reality? Unstable?"
Now again, we're speculating here. These are what-if results, but they're not pulled from thin air. Similar anomalies have been documented before at Princeton's PEAR Lab, in CIA archives, even in obscure physics reports.
So the shocking part isn't imagining Wright producing these effects. The shocking part is realizing science might already have brushed up against them, then quietly filed them away.
And if those results ever became public, the debate wouldn't be about whether Wright was right. The debate would be whether humanity's ready to handle what that truth means.
So let's say, just for the sake of speculation, that Wright's claims held up under the most rigorous conditions. What then?
For starters, the entire foundation of modern science would shake. If consciousness can operate independently of the brain, we're no longer talking about neurons firing, we're talking about mind as a fundamental force of nature.
That means your thoughts aren't just electrical sparks in your head, they might be ripples in the very fabric of reality. Suddenly, meditation isn't just relaxing, it's quantum engineering.
And if Wright's quantum double is real, if you can access versions of yourself across parallel realities, then every sci-fi show about multiverses just turned into a documentary preview.
The social implications? Massive. Imagine governments racing to weaponize consciousness, religions scrambling to rewrite doctrine, and your neighbor suddenly bragging about his side hustle as an interdimensional consultant.
But here's the serious part. It would force humanity to rethink who we are. not machines of flesh and bone, but explorers of infinite possibilities.
Of course, not everyone would celebrate. Many scientists would resist, terrified of losing careers built on materialism. Power structures that depend on the old worldview would cling to it desperately.
And then there's Wright himself. We can imagine him smiling, maybe a little tired, saying, "I told him 30 years ago, the truth doesn't need protection. Lies do."
So the real question isn't whether science could prove Wright right. The real question is, are we ready for a reality that refuses to stay in its box? We've walked through the real history of consciousness research and imagined what might happen if Darius Wright were ever put to the test. But now, it's your turn. Have you ever experienced something science would call impossible?
If these experiments were real, would you want the results made public or hidden away?
Here's a challenge. Try a simplified version of Wright's observer protocol. Just sit quietly, focus your awareness outside your body, and write down anything that comes.
Then share your experience in the comments or on social media with the hashtag #WrightExperiment. Who knows? Maybe your results will surprise you too.
If this episode opened your mind, give it a like. It helps more people discover these hidden stories.
Share this video with someone who calls themselves a skeptic. Let them wrestle with the evidence and the possibilities.
And drop a comment. If you had access to your other self, what's the first thing you'd ask?
Up next, you can dive deeper. On the left, the Wright Protocol explains step by step. On the right, the real history of Project Stargate.
Remember, the question isn't whether Wright was right. The question is, are we finally ready to find out?